In a packed federal courtroom streamed to over 62 million Americans, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett is blindsided by Justice Clarence Thomas, who strips her of her seat and bans her from running for office for 10 years, without allowing her a single word in her defense. But just 5 minutes later, she turns the entire hearing on its head, pulling out a sealed envelope that reveals what the court never wanted the public to see: secret luxury gifts, hidden relationships, and rulings that now look like deals. The judge is shaken, the nation erupts, and the foundation of the system begins to crack. What did Jasmine say that made the most powerful man in the room fall completely silent? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. It was just past 8:15 a.m. when Jasmine Crockett stepped through the towering glass doors of the Atlanta Federal Courthouse. The frost hadn't yet melted from the marble steps, but the chill that awaited inside had nothing to do with weather. Her name was plastered across every journalist's tablet outside. Crockett accused of ethics violation, hearing in 45 minutes. No preparation, no prior notice, just a single email at midnight, summoning her to answer for a charge so vague it bordered on fiction. Improperly accepting charitable donations through Hope Forward, the same program that had fed thousands during the pandemic. She arrived with nothing but a briefcase and her composure. What no one could explain, even now, is why Justice Clarence Thomas, a sitting member of the United States Supreme Court, was the one presiding. This was not a constitutional challenge. This was not a federal appeal. This was a basic ethics hearing wrapped in legal theater. Yet there he was, seated behind the elevated bench in his black robe, unsmiling, eyes low and heavy. When he entered the room, a hush followed, more fear than respect. The air turned tight. Jasmine's attorney leaned in and whispered, "This isn't a hearing. It's a setup." Jasmine stood as the clerk read out the charge. She raised her hand to speak, but Thomas cut her off mid-breath. "This is not a forum for grandstanding," he said, the words dry and final. She tried again, to clarify, to ask for time to review evidence, to defend the integrity of Hope Forward. Again, the gavel struck. "You are not entitled to editorialize," he snapped. It wasn't just unorthodox, it was authoritarian. Every safeguard of due process, every norm of fairness was dismantled in real time, before a silent courtroom and live-streamed audience of millions. And then, without witness testimony, without cross-examination, without even a formal motion to deliberate, came the blow. "It is the decision of this court," Thomas declared, "that Representative Jasmine Crockett is suspended from her office and barred from seeking or holding any elected position for a period of 10 years. No hesitation, no emotion, just a verdict that struck with surgical cruelty. Gas rippled through the courtroom like thunder behind glass. A woman in the gallery dropped her coffee. One young man shouted, "This is insane!" before being escorted out. Cameras didn't blink. Reporters typed like stenographers at war. But Jasmine remained still. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. Her stillness was louder than any protest. It wasn't acceptance. It was restraint. Because she knew something the court didn't. This wasn't the end of her fight. It was the beginning of their exposure. Outside, within moments, headlines screamed across every screen. Crockett silenced. Thomas delivers stunning blow. Justice or ambush? Power protecting power? And buried between lines of speculation, one quote from a Georgetown law professor summed up the nation's unease. This wasn't a legal proceeding. It was a warning to every voice that challenges comfort, wealth, and legacy. What Jasmine had just endured wasn't merely unjust. It was designed to be humiliating. But beneath the silence of her exit, there was something brewing, something no robe, no bench, no billion-dollar alliance could contain. As the echo of the gavel faded and the official verdict sealed her political fate, Justice Clarence Thomas leaned forward, not to conclude the hearing, but to humiliate her. What he said next wasn't law. It was personal. "You are not here because you serve the people," he said, his voice sharpened by something colder than authority. "You are here because of partisan privilege, because your party protects its own." The words hung in the courtroom like a stain that couldn't be scrubbed clean. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The accusation cut deeper precisely because, of how calmly it was delivered. For a split second, the room froze, not from respect, but from the weight of what had just been said. Cameras zoomed in, staffers stiffened. Her lawyer began to rise but paused when Jasmine did nothing. Nothing but blink once. She remained seated, hands folded on the table before her. But inside her mind, the past, her real past, began to rise, uninvited and undeniable. She was 16. No cameras, no bench, no protection, just pavement and flashing lights. She had taken the long route home after a double shift at the corner diner in Highland Park, still wearing her name tag, still holding a bag of leftover fries meant for her younger brother. That night, 2 patrol cars stopped her less than 5 blocks from home. "You don't belong in this neighborhood," one officer said as he reached for her arm. When she asked what she did wrong, they told her she fit a description. No warrant, no explanation, no apology. She was thrown in the back of the cruiser like she didn't exist. In the holding cell, she watched time move like it hated her until morning came and they let her go without a word. No charges, no record, just trauma tucked into silence. That moment didn't make her bitter. It made her precise. It didn't teach her to hate power. It taught her how it moved, how it spoke, how it hid behind legalese. That's why she went to law school, not to wear the robe, but to confront those who misused it. She defended clients who had no one. She took cases no one else would. She stood in courtrooms with secondhand shoes and a voice full of purpose. While others raised millions from super PACs, she raised hope, one conversation at a time, one vote at a time. Her campaign was built not in back rooms, but in barbershops and church basements. And now the man who had spent decades surrounded by billionaires dared to call her privileged. So no, she didn't speak, because words would have made it smaller. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was defiance held in its purest form. The courtroom thought she was sitting still, but something in her posture had changed. Subtle but seismic. Not a woman defeated, a woman calculating. Because she knew what Clarence Thomas had just done wasn't a sentence. It was a mistake. And mistakes in her world had consequences. And just as the courtroom settled into the false calm of recess, papers rustling, murmurs rising, something far more dangerous than noise passed beneath the table. A quiet act of defiance wrapped in gold. Jasmine had barely stepped off the witness platform when she felt it. An almost imperceptible tap against her fingertips, followed by the smooth edge of a sealed envelope. It was Marcus Hale, her longtime ally and perhaps the only person in the room who understood the full weight of what was unfolding. He didn't make eye contact. He didn't need to. Their work had never relied on words when the stakes were this high. The envelope was slim, precise, and gold. Oddly elegant, yet unassuming enough not to raise alarms. Jasmine slid it under her legal notepad as she returned to her seat, her face unreadable. Moments later, Justice Thomas called a 20-minute recess. Lawyers stood, clerks buzzed around like wasps let loose, and the media whispered into microphones, speculating over optics and outcomes. But Jasmine sat motionless, back straight, hands resting on the desk like a statue carved out of purpose. Her fingers found the envelope again, only this time they peeled it open. What unfolded before her was not evidence. It was revelation. The first document was a financial ledger, cleanly formatted but damning in its clarity. She scanned it with disciplined focus. Private lodging, Amalfi Coast, $56,800, paid by H. Crow. Her eyes moved line by line, expression fixed, as if she were simply reviewing case notes. Tuition paid for great-nephew, $103,000. No federal disclosure filed. Another page. Patek Philippe luxury watch, estimated $71,000, hand-delivered. Jasmine's stomach didn't drop. It anchored. This wasn't rumor or innuendo. This was paper, dates, values, signatures. And then she saw the line boxed in thick red ink near the bottom of the last page. Timeline cross-reference. 7 Supreme Court rulings with financial implications for Crow Holdings and affiliates. Gifts documented within 10 to 14 days of each ruling. She leaned back slowly, the weight of truth settling over her like armor. It was stunning, yes, but it was also familiar. She had seen injustice before. She had lived it. But this was institutional rot dressed in black robes, an ancient precedent. She looked around the courtroom. The cameras were still on. The American public was still watching. They had seen a woman silenced, a verdict rushed, a life's work condemned in under an hour. But what they hadn't seen, yet, was the moment power gets caught red-handed. And Jasmine Crockett was not the kind of woman who let truth die in silence. Now armed with proof that could shake the very foundation beneath the judge's seat, Jasmine didn't rise for redemption. She rose for something far more dangerous: clarity. When the court reconvened, the room felt heavier. The gavel struck once, sharp, abrupt, almost irritated, and murmurs died in mid-breath. Jasmine stood up slowly, deliberately, before being addressed. Her hands remained at her sides, her posture unshakable. She looked not at Thomas, but forward, like she was speaking to something larger than the court. "Your Honor," she said evenly, each syllable firm without being confrontational, "I respectfully request to make a brief clarification regarding the record and the implications made about my character." Her tone didn't waver. It didn't plead. It simply existed, like something immovable. Justice Clarence Thomas didn't immediately respond. He adjusted his glasses, eyes flicking briefly toward the press gallery, where over a dozen reporters sat poised with notepads, phones, and unblinking expressions. The pressure was real now. He could feel it, not just from her, but from beyond the courtroom walls. Journalists lived tweeting every inflection, legal analysts dissecting his bias in real time, public opinion tightening like a noose. "This proceeding is concluded," he replied flatly, resting his hand near the gavel again. "There is nothing more to add." Jasmine held her ground. She didn't protest. Instead, she said one line, quiet, pointed, undeniable. "Then let the record reflect that denying the truth is not the same as disproving it." It wasn't a threat. It was a warning, and it landed with far more weight than any objection could. A few members of the press visibly leaned forward. One camera zoomed closer. A silence followed. Dense, charged, the kind that makes even a judge question whether to proceed. Thomas glanced toward a clerk, then back at Jasmine, then at the door, calculation flickering just beneath the surface. With a voice far less certain than before, he muttered, 2 minutes. Stay within the bounds of relevance." Jasmine gave the slightest nod. No smile, no gloating. She simply stepped toward the microphone, a folder in hand and fire in her chest. Because she wasn't here to ask for fairness anymore. She was here to deliver it, with 2 minutes granted and the eyes of a nation watching. Jasmine didn't just approach the microphone. She approached history, carrying truth like a torch into a room designed to keep it in the dark. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The weight of her words would come from precision, not volume. Jasmine opened the manila folder slowly, her fingers careful, not theatrical, as if handling something sacred. One by one, she lifted the documents, clean, dated, irrefutable, and held them before her like surgical instruments, prepared for an operation that had waited too long. "Your Honor," she began, her tone measured but unmistakably firm, "I have been accused today of accepting lawful donations from a nonprofit that feeds children, funds housing, and uplifts neglected communities. For that, I was condemned without defense. Yet what I hold in my hand are records of undisclosed gifts, gifts received by a sitting Supreme Court justice from private billionaires with direct interest in federal rulings." She let that sentence settle. It didn't fall. It landed hard. She read aloud. "Private yacht accommodations in the Amalfi Coast, valued at $56,800. Paid for by Harlan Crow." She didn't look at Thomas yet. She turned to the room. "Tuition payments totaling $103,000 for a relative. No disclosures filed, no questions asked. A luxury Patek Philippe watch, valued at $71,000, delivered by hand. And all of this," she paused, lifting the final sheet, "cross-referenced with 7 federal rulings that directly impacted the financial interests of the gift giver. 7, all ruled in their favor." There was no noise in the room, no coughs, no shifting chairs, just breath held in collective suspension. Then she looked up, directly at him. Not with contempt, not with triumph, but with clarity. "Your Honor," she said slowly, each word as deliberate as a chisel-breaking stone, "if I can be disqualified for documented contributions used for public good, then let me ask you, with full respect to this institution, who investigates the justice who receives private luxury from those who benefit by his hand? Who holds power accountable when power wears a robe?" The silence that followed wasn't just shock, it was recognition. Recognition that something sacred had just been said out loud. Something usually whispered in back rooms, avoided on headlines, or buried under layers of decorum. But not today, not anymore. Jasmine hadn't come to defend herself. She had come to remind the court that even justice must answer to justice. Jasmine had not come to plead for justice. She had come to peel back its mask. And now, with every eye fixed on her and every screen broadcasting live, she pulled the truth into the light, one fact at a time. She pressed the remote with the quiet certainty of someone who no longer needed permission to speak. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the projection screen flickered to life. The first image was unmistakable. Clarence Thomas sat in the sun-drenched lounge of a private yacht, a glass of champagne in hand, the cliffs of Italy rising behind him like a postcard for a world the average citizen would never see. The watermark in the corner marked the date, May 24th. Jasmine didn't narrate with outrage. She let the photo breathe, its implications loud enough. Then came the second slide, an official court docket from the very same day. Thomas v. Crow Holdings, a case involving the interests of the very billionaire who had financed the trip. Jasmine let the two images linger side by side. The contrast didn't need embellishment. She advanced again. This time, a spreadsheet, tightly formatted, methodical. It listed 7 different rulings across 5 years, each one involving entities connected to Harlan Crow or his business interests. Each one ended with a decision that favored him, and each one, Jasmine noted aloud, coincided with a gift. Flights, lodging, tuition payments, even a rare $71,000 Patek Philippe watch. "These aren't coincidences," she said calmly. "They are data points. And when the highest court in the land becomes indistinguishable from the favors it receives, we are no longer governed by law. We are governed by arrangements." Then she turned toward the courtroom and said, "Mr. Reuben Glassman, please step forward." The former clerk walked to the microphone slowly, like a man who had carried his silence too long. He wore no robe, no badge, just a gray suit and the look of someone about to lose whatever protection anonymity had offered him. He unfolded a piece of paper, hands steady but voice restrained. "I served as scheduling and records coordinator under Justice Thomas," he began. "In mid-2021, I was directed to remove flight manifests and calendar entries that linked the justice to properties owned by Harlan Crow." He looked up, the words suddenly heavier. "I was told it was for clarity. I said no. A week later, my access was revoked. A month later, I was gone." The room didn't erupt. It imploded, silently, inward, as the enormity of what had just been confessed settled into the floorboards and the faces of every person present. Even the courtroom guards, who just hours ago had glanced past Jasmine like she was a formality, now stood stiff, uncertain. Jasmine said nothing. She didn't move. She let the silence deepen until it became undeniable. Then she turned, not toward the audience, not toward the press, but toward the one man who hadn't yet spoken. Justice Clarence Thomas. He wasn't leaning forward anymore. He had shrunk somehow, pulled back into his chair, like a man hoping the wood might swallow him whole. His hands were no longer folded. They gripped the armrest with whitened knuckles. His gaze, once fixed and imperious, now flickered unfocused, as if searching for the nearest escape. But there was none, and that's when a voice, clear, calm, unmistakably human, rose from the back of the gallery. "Your Honor, is there anything you'd like to say?" No answer came, not even a blink, just the sound of a breath caught somewhere between shame and silence. And in the seconds that followed the question, "Is there anything you'd like to say?" what had once been unthinkable now hovered palpably in the air, that the man behind the robe might finally be the one on trial. Justice Clarence Thomas straightened in his chair, or at least tried to. His fingers gripped the edge of the bench with visible effort, as if holding on to the authority that had, for so long, gone unchallenged. But authority only works when people believe in it, and belief was evaporating fast. The room had shifted. The silence that once followed his gavel now belonged to Jasmine Crockett. The courtroom was no longer a stage for punishment. It had become a mirror, and the reflection looking back at Thomas was unraveling. He cleared his throat once. The sound barely registered. Even the court officers, trained to maintain order, stood in uncertain posture, watching, not waiting for orders, but for history to tip. Then, like a controlled detonation, the voice of U.S. Deputy Counsel Ayla Rendon pierced the silence. She stood up from her seat at the government's table, her federal badge clipped visibly to her blazer, and said firmly, "Madam Clerk, please pause the session. The Department of Justice requests immediate adjournment pending review of newly submitted materials." There was no motion filed, no sidebar, just authority, real authority, spoken without hesitation. Thomas looked at her, but his gaze did not challenge. It registered, slowly, deeply, because for the first time in decades, the balance of power had tilted, and it was no longer in his favor. Rendon continued, her voice level and direct. "In light of the evidence presented and testimonial disclosures, we are initiating a federal ethics investigation into potential violations of judicial conduct codes." Gasps were unnecessary now. The moment didn't need drama. It carried its own gravity. Furthermore, she added, the department finds insufficient cause to proceed against Congresswoman Crockett. The charges are without merit and are hereby nullified in the record. At that, Jasmine, still standing, still silent, closed the folder before her with measured calm. She didn't gloat. She didn't even blink in Thomas's direction. Her stillness now held more weight than any verdict could. Thomas remained seated for a beat longer than was comfortable. The cameras, still live, zoomed in slightly as his hands slowly dropped from the bench to his lap. He looked around the room, not with the practiced detachment of a senior justice, but with the hollowed awareness of a man who realized the room no longer belonged to him. He tried to speak. His mouth parted, then closed again. No words came. There was nothing to salvage, no ground left to stand on. And so, without a single sentence of defense, Clarence Thomas rose. It wasn't the rise of a man in command. It was the slow, reluctant ascent of someone walking away from something already lost. He didn't ask to be dismissed. He didn't issue closing remarks. He simply turned his back to the courtroom he had controlled for the last hour, and the country for far longer, and stepped down from the bench. Every movement was recorded, every step archived. The cameras didn't blink, and neither did the nation. Behind him, the courtroom remained frozen. No one moved. Jasmine stood like a sentinel, unmoved and unmoving, while her legal team sat in silent awe. The clerk's fingers hovered over the keys but didn't type. The security guards by the doors didn't reach for the handles. The only sound was the soft scrape of leather soles on marble tile as the justice who once believed himself untouchable walked out. Not as a symbol, not as a hero, not even as a villain. Just as a man, stripped of the illusion that once cloaked him. And the cameras kept rolling, because accountability, once rare in that room, had finally shown its face. Not as vengeance, not even as victory, but as undeniable consequence. As the heavy doors clicked shut behind Clarence Thomas, leaving behind only the echo of everything he didn't say, all eyes slowly turned, not toward the bench he abandoned, but toward the woman who never needed it to speak with authority. Jasmine didn't rise. She didn't need the elevation. Her voice, clear, grounded, unshaken, cut through the charged air like steel through smoke. She sat exactly where they had tried to silence her, at the defendant's table, now transformed into something far more powerful, a witness stand for the truth. "Let me be clear," she began, her eyes scanning the room, not for approval, but for accountability. "I'm not here to replace him. I don't want that chair. I don't want its weight, its legacy, or its shadow." She leaned forward, her tone steady and intimate, like someone daring the system to look itself in the mirror. "I just want to live in a country where that chair, any chair of power, can't be bought by private jets, handwritten checks, and silence disguised as tradition. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. Because justice should never wear a price tag, she continued, each word falling like a verdict. And respect for the law should come from the people it protects, not the donors it serves. The gallery was still, no shifting, no murmurs, only attention, taut and reverent. In that moment, Jasmine wasn't addressing the court. She was addressing the country, every person watching who had ever wondered if speaking truth to power was worth it. And now they had their answer. And with the weight of corruption laid bare and the gavel of fear finally silenced, Jasmine did not pause to bask in vindication. She moved instead to do what her accusers never expected: rebuild the very system that tried to crush her. Still seated at the defendant's table, Jasmine took a breath. Not out of relief, but out of resolve. She didn't glance toward the press, nor toward the still reeling judicial staff. Her eyes locked instead on the court stenographer and the congressional observers seated in the second row. Every one of them scribbling, typing, documenting history as it unfolded in real time. Her voice didn't rise. It deepened. I request the following be entered into the official record as proposed policy reform, she said, each word as deliberate as a hammer striking iron. The room held its breath again, not out of shock this time, but because they sensed something real, something structural was being born. She raised 3 fingers slowly, not for drama, but for clarity. First, she said, a federal statute mandating that all judges, state and federal, publicly disclose any gifts, trips, or financial favors on a quarterly basis. Not annually, not selectively, every quarter, every dollar, no exceptions. The tone in her voice didn't ask for permission. It demanded accountability. Second, she continued, an unbreachable protection clause for judicial whistleblowers. We protect those who expose corruption in corporations and Congress. Why not the courts? Without that, truth suffocates before it ever gets to speak. Then came the third. Her voice slowed, not out of fatigue, but gravity. And third, she said, her eyes narrowing slightly, the immediate formation of an independent judicial oversight council, fully funded, bipartisan, and outside the control of the executive branch. No judge should ever be immune to scrutiny simply because of their title. Power without inspection is not justice. It's royalty in disguise. A quiet gasp rippled through the back row, not scandalized but stunned. No one in recent memory had said it so plainly, so cleanly in the very room where such statements could cost a career. And yet Jasmine didn't flinch. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was reverent. No one moved. Not a single lawmaker objected. In fact, 2 Senate legal aides immediately began transcribing her language verbatim into draft legislative text. The court recorder looked briefly toward the acting judicial moderator, who nodded solemnly. Let it be entered. No one asked for clarification. No one called it out of order, because it wasn't just appropriate, it was necessary. Jasmine's proposals weren't political theater. They were blueprints. And the people in that room, many of whom had come expecting a spectacle, now found themselves sitting in the first pages of reform. She closed the folder on the desk in front of her and folded her hands once more. Not as a defendant, not even as a victor, but as a citizen demanding the country she served finally serve its own people back. The weight of what had just happened began to register in the expressions of those around her. A court officer looked down at his badge as if questioning what it meant. A young congressional intern blinked twice, then leaned forward, typing faster than before. One woman from the House Judiciary Committee wiped a single tear, subtle but real. In that moment, the trial was over. But something far more important had begun. Because reform doesn't start in private meetings, it doesn't begin in law books or editorials. It begins where injustice is confronted in public, and someone dares to say, this must change. Jasmine Crockett didn't just survive the system that tried to silence her. She reshaped it while the cameras were still rolling, while the echoes of a fallen gavel still lingered in the room. And not one voice dared to say no. And as the courtroom emptied, its power rearranged, its silence forever altered. The real verdict wasn't handed down inside the chamber. It was delivered by a nation that had just watched the veil of untouchable power get ripped away in real time. Within minutes of the gavel's final strike, the world outside erupted. News anchors interrupted scheduled broadcasts mid-sentence. A CNN chyron blazed across the screen. Jasmine Crockett flips the bench. Clarence Thomas exits in silence. On MSNBC, one stunned legal analyst whispered, "I never thought I'd see the day." Meanwhile, inside newsrooms across New York, D.C., and Los Angeles, editors shouted into headsets, reworking front pages and evening rundowns on the fly. Politico pushed the headline before the ink was dry on their draft. Congresswoman tries for defense, delivers a reckoning instead. But it was the Washington Post that captured the truth with the brutal clarity history demands. Jasmine Crockett just tried a Supreme Court justice. She used facts. He had nothing to say. The live stream replay hit 15 million views in under 2 hours. By the 12th hour, it had crossed 60 million. Twitter collapsed under the weight of hashtags that now felt more like rallying cries than trends. Charged judges are not gods, Jarshi justice without privilege, and who judges the judge? The video clip, just 1 minute and 54 seconds long, of Jasmine calmly asking, "Who holds power accountable when power wears a robe?" was shared over 11 million times before sunrise. And it wasn't just retweets from activists or watchdog groups. Celebrities, veterans, former prosecutors, even retired judges were reposting it with captions like, "Finally, she said what we couldn't," and "That courtroom changed something." The footage looped on every screen: airport terminals, gym televisions, office lobbies, coffee shops in Kansas, and court waiting rooms in Queens. People paused mid-conversation, mid-commute, mid-life to watch the moment Clarence Thomas lowered his gaze and walked away from the bench. For once, the silence of a powerful man spoke louder than any defense he might have offered. Late-night shows canceled comedy segments to address what had just happened. Jimmy Fallon looked straight into the camera and said, "Tonight we were supposed to laugh, but instead we watched history change its posture." On cable networks, the political divide blurred, if only briefly. Even conservative anchors, often loyal to the institution of the court, struggled to find a narrative that made the footage look like anything other than what it was: a reckoning. Fox's Laura Ingraham hesitated on air, her tone uncharacteristically somber, admitting, "I may disagree with her politics, but Congresswoman Crockett demanded accountability. And that's something no American should oppose." And across comment sections, threads, and forum pages, the country wasn't just reacting, they were recalibrating. Posts poured in from public defenders, mothers, veterans, and former clerks. A retired judge from Colorado wrote, 30 years on the bench, and I've never seen anything like that. Not just courage, precision, a moral scalpel." One law school professor assigned the full transcript of Jasmine's testimony for mandatory reading, writing in the syllabus, "Not just legal argument, civic responsibility incarnate." But perhaps most powerful of all were the messages from people who had no microphone, no law degree, no political seat. A high school student in Detroit posted, "I want to be Jasmine Crockett when I grow up." A woman in Houston posted a selfie with the caption, "For the first time, my daughter saw someone in power who looked like us and refused to kneel." And beneath every major news outlet's coverage, pinned to the top comment, was one unshakable truth echoed over and over again. She didn't just win, she changed the rules. Even Congress felt it. By mid-afternoon the next day, 3 different senators from both parties had contacted their staff to inquire about drafting legislation modeled after Jasmine's 3 reform proposals. The buzz inside Capitol Hill was unlike anything in recent memory. Aides reported phones ringing nonstop. Constituents weren't just angry, they were activated. Calls came in not with outrage, but with resolve. "We saw what she did. We expect you to follow through." It wasn't about Clarence Thomas anymore. It was about a culture that had long allowed robes to serve as armor and silence as strategy. Jasmine Crockett had cracked that armor, Not with rage, but with restraint. Not with partisanship, but with proof. Not with spectacle, but with systemic truth. And people felt that. They knew it instinctively. They'd seen outrage before, theatrics before. But this was different. This was surgical, controlled, inevitable. By the end of that first night, over a dozen op-eds had been drafted, each one trying to capture what exactly had happened inside that courtroom. Some called it a judicial earthquake. Others labeled it a masterclass in democratic resilience. But the title that gained the most traction came from a simple blog post by a former law clerk in Chicago. It read, "She cross-examined a justice without leaving her seat." And in the end, that was the truth that stuck. Because Jasmine Crockett didn't need a robe, a gavel, or a bench. She didn't need to yell. She didn't need to beg. All she needed was the truth, and the will to say it where it wasn't welcome. And once she did, America didn't just listen. It stood up. But the shock waves didn't stop at the courthouse steps. In fact, the real tremor hadn't hit until Congress, staring at a nation newly awake, realized it had no choice but to act or be buried by its own silence. Just 72 hours after Jasmine Crockett left that courtroom, Congress moved with a swiftness rarely seen outside times of war or impeachment. On a stormy Monday morning, beneath skies that seemed to echo the weight of the moment, a bipartisan emergency session was convened in the Hart Senate office building. The room was standing room only. Senators, House members, legal scholars, and journalists crammed shoulder to shoulder, eyes fixed on the placards before them. Special Investigatory Committee on Federal Judicial Ethics. It wasn't just a hearing, it was a signal, a line drawn in marble. The committee's formation came after an emergency closed-door vote, passing 91-7 in the Senate and unanimously in the House Ethics Subcommittee, a level of consensus not seen in years. What Jasmine had ignited had become more than a scandal. It had become a mirror, and no one wanted to be caught on the wrong side of it when the nation was still watching, still sharing, still demanding more. The hashtag number sign, oversight or obsolete, had trended worldwide just the night before. One congressman was overheard muttering, "We miss me too. We won't miss this." Within its first 48 hours, the committee issued formal disclosure demands to 4 sitting federal judges, including 2 appellate justices with ties to the same benefactor network exposed during Jasmine's hearing. The language of the requests was sharp and unflinching. Failure to provide complete records may result in immediate suspension pending further review under federal ethics code. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a reckoning. Reporters descended like hawks, lining the marble corridors of the Rayburn building, as aides scurried past with sealed envelopes and expressionless faces. The committee chair, Representative Linda Ashbourne, a moderate from Ohio not known for firebrand politics, stood before a sea of microphones and declared, "We are no longer asking whether misconduct exists within the federal judiciary. We are asking how deep it runs and who let it fester." The cameras loved her, but the public loved something more: action. Subpoenas were drafted that same afternoon. Inside chambers, white-gloved clerks were ordered to pull a decade's worth of judicial travel records, private asset declarations, and sealed advisory memos. And for the first time in modern memory, the Judicial Conference, long considered an impenetrable old boys club, received a congressional demand for cooperation under penalty of defunding. The air had changed. The fear was no longer on the faces of the accused, but on those who had enabled the silence for years. 3 federal judges, under growing public scrutiny, released hurried statements claiming they had inadvertently omitted certain gifts, investments, or personal hospitality from their reports. But the tone was different now, defensive, desperate, and no one was buying it. One document revealed that a sitting judge had received a fully funded safari retreat in Botswana, valued at $82,000, just weeks before ruling in favor of a multinational oil company tied to the trip's sponsor. It was no longer just about Clarence Thomas. It was about a culture, a machinery, a myth of untouchability that had, at last, met resistance. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett was not in front of cameras. She declined all requests for interviews. She didn't tweet. She didn't release a statement. Instead, she returned to committee hearings, housing forums, and town halls, still dressed in muted colors, still carrying a plain leather folder, still answering every question with calm precision. When asked by a young intern in a hallway what she felt about the investigation, she simply said, "I'm glad they're looking. But this isn't about me. This is about the rot we pretended wasn't there." Back in the Capitol, whispers of legislation became drafts. 3 reform bills were introduced within 5 days, each citing Crockett disclosure standards as their model. Staffers worked overnight. Veteran lawmakers who had long tiptoed around judicial accountability now leaned into it with both hands. Behind closed doors, some admitted they had waited years for a moment like this. A name, a face, and a fire they could stand behind without looking like opportunists. And Jasmine had given them that, not by asking, not by shouting, but by enduring, confronting, and refusing to flinch when everything was thrown at her. The pressure didn't let up. Protesters stood outside federal courthouses in 22 states holding cardboard gavels and wearing black robes with dollar signs drawn in red. Law school students organized nationwide accountability audits, cross-referencing financial disclosures with rulings for signs of bias. A single spreadsheet created by a Berkeley grad student mapping gifts and decisions went viral, accumulating over 9 million views in a day. America wasn't watching anymore. It was working. And in one of the most unexpected moves yet, the American Bar Association released a rare public statement calling for mandatory third-party financial auditing of federal judges, backed by over 400 retired judges and justices. It read, "We do not question the need for judicial independence. But independence without scrutiny is no longer justice. It is theater." By the end of the week, the committee had grown from 7 members to 15, with co-chairs from both parties, and a mandate expanded to include review of lifetime appointments, lobbying contacts, and post-retirement speaking fees. For the first time in American legal history, the term ethical audit began appearing on official Judiciary Committee documents. The system had blinked, and none had been possible before that single afternoon when one congresswoman in a storm of accusation had turned the mirror back on the people holding it. Jasmine Crockett didn't just challenge a verdict. She cracked open an institution and made it bleed enough to matter. And the country, hungry, furious, awake, did the rest. The courtroom may have gone quiet, but the system had only just begun to speak. Even as the storm she had unleashed surged into every corner of the country, Jasmine Crockett stepped out of the courthouse, not as a politician basking in triumph, but as a woman who had walked through fire carrying truth and refused to let it be turned into spectacle. The steps outside the courthouse were a wall of sound, reporters shouting her name, camera shutters snapping like a machine gun volley, a frenzy of microphones lunging forward as she emerged into the open air. The flash of lights lit her face in bursts, but she didn't blink. Her eyes were forward, unfazed, her walk unhurried. She wasn't hiding, but she wasn't here to perform either. Around her, the crowd surged with questions. "Do you believe this will change the court? Is Clarence Thomas fit to remain on the bench? Congresswoman, will you be filing ethics legislation yourself?" A dozen questions a second, and every journalist in the pack hoping to be the one she acknowledged. But Jasmine kept her folder tucked tight beneath her arm, her expression composed. Not detached, not cold, but focused, as if her work was still unfinished. She didn't stop at the first row of microphones. She didn't stop at the second either. It wasn't until she reached the third step from the bottom, where the press line thinned and only one camera crew remained, that she paused. A young CNN reporter, eyes wide with urgency and reverence, leaned forward slightly, not shouting like the others. Her voice was low, respectful. "Congresswoman Crockett, what did this moment mean to you?" Jasmine turned to face her, just for a second. The flashbulbs dimmed. The noise seemed to drop. There was no triumph in her posture, no victory grin, no righteous finger-pointing, just exhaustion tempered by resolve. Then she said with a clarity that cut through the chaos like a scalpel through noise, "I didn't come here to win. I came to end the things we let live in the dark, the things we don't talk about but still let hold power over us. That ends now." The reporter didn't speak, neither did the cameras. For a moment, the entire crowd was still. Not because of drama, because of truth. It was not a quote made for headlines. It was a sentence carved from lived reality, a reminder that some battles aren't about applause, but about drawing lines where no one dared before. Then Jasmine turned away, descended the final steps, and walked into the street, not surrounded by handlers, not trailing an entourage, but moving with the quiet force of someone who had just told the system it could no longer pretend not to see itself. But Jasmine Crockett had no interest in being remembered for a moment, no matter how explosive. It was the aftermath she cared about, and what came next would prove she hadn't just confronted power, she was already reshaping it. Exactly 7 days after the hearing that changed the course of public trust in the judiciary, a sealed envelope arrived at the Office of Legislative Counsel, its contents already whispered about in every corridor of Capitol Hill. Typed across the front in plain black ink were 5 words: Judicial Transparency Act of 2025. No dramatics, no branding. Just the beginning of a new fight, on her terms. It wasn't drafted by a committee of consultants or shaped to appease donors. Jasmine had written every section herself, long after the cameras were gone, working through nights fueled by conviction rather than headlines. The language was unflinching. Quarterly disclosure of all gifts and financial favors for all federal judges, lifetime bans on accepting benefits from litigants or lobbyists, mandatory ethics audits conducted by an independent oversight council reporting to Congress, not the executive. It was the kind of bill that, months earlier, would have been dismissed as idealistic. Now it was undeniable. The document hit the desks of lawmakers like a lightning bolt. Within 6 hours, the signatures began to appear, first from progressives, then centrists, and then, stunningly, from the other side of the aisle, a Republican from Utah, a moderate from Pennsylvania. By sunset, both parties had signed on as co-sponsors, a symbolic and strategic move that sent a clear message. Jasmine Crockett's call for accountability had crossed the red-blue divide. It wasn't politics anymore. It was necessity. The Judiciary Committee fast-tracked it for reading, and by Friday, hearings were scheduled for early markup. Even the oldest, most jaded staffers couldn't remember a reform bill moving this fast without the backdrop of national tragedy. But this had been a tragedy, just one that had finally been recorded, replayed, and no longer ignored. As the news broke, the New York Times didn't waste a second. The headline ran bold and unapologetic across its Sunday front page. From defendant to architect, Crockett's judicial reform gains unlikely momentum. In the lead paragraph, the piece captured what millions were already thinking. What was expected to be a public fall from grace has instead become the foundation of a bipartisan movement. The hearing that was supposed to end Jasmine Crockett's career may instead have revived the very soul of judicial oversight. Editorial boards across the country followed suit. The Boston Globe called it the most meaningful post-Roberts era judicial bill introduced in 2 decades. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution referred to Crockett as the reluctant fire starter of a badly needed legal reckoning. Cable news ran segment after segment, not just on the bill, but on the fact that it had been born not in a lobbyist's office, but in the crucible of injustice, right there in front of the American people. And the public responded in kind. Over 3 million citizens signed an online petition in support of the bill within the first 4 days. Town halls exploded in attendance, not in protest, but in unified demand. Pass the act, clean the bench. One viral video showed a group of high school students in Newark holding a mock judiciary hearing with a cardboard gavel, chanting, "Crockett's Law Now." It wasn't just a political moment. It had become a civic education, something that people could see, name, and believe in. And through it all, Jasmine never shifted her tone. She refused to speak in slogans. When asked if she thought the bill would pass, she answered simply, "If it doesn't, we'll reintroduce it. If it's watered down, we'll rewrite it. But we won't unsee what we've seen. Not anymore." Her office issued no fancy promotional graphics, no fundraising emails quoting her testimony, just the full text of the bill, available online in 10 languages, with a bold link that read, "Read it, then hold us to it." The message had landed. This wasn't about left or right. It was about something older and more sacred, the expectation that justice, once broken open, must answer for itself. And Jasmine Crockett had not only answered. She'd handed the country the pen and said, "Write better laws." She didn't need to say she'd changed the conversation. Every newsroom, every legal institution, every household that once believed courts were beyond reach now knew. One voice, spoken without fear, could call an entire branch of government to the stand. And this time, the people weren't just listening. They were writing history with her. But while Washington trembled and legislation moved with historic speed, Jasmine Crockett didn't linger in the spotlight. She returned to the only courtroom that had ever truly mattered to her, the community that sent her to fight in the first place. She was back in Texas before the headlines had even cooled, her name still trending, her bill still being dissected by legal analysts and political strategists. But Jasmine wasn't pacing marble corridors or basking in the heat of national acclaim. She was walking into neighborhood centers lit by flickering fluorescence, where folding chairs creaked and coffee was served in styrofoam cups. She held no press conferences. There were no velvet robes, no handlers, just chalkboards behind her and folding tables in front, scattered with handwritten questions and notepads passed between retirees, veterans, single mothers, and students in scuffed sneakers. In one room, the ceiling fan rattled so loudly she had to raise her voice just slightly to be heard. But she never complained. She answered every question, never watching the clock. It was in one of those rooms, a municipal rec center just outside of Dallas, the windows fogged by winter, that a moment unfolded that would etch itself into history deeper than any headline. The town hall had been going for 90 minutes when an older woman stood from the back row, her cane clicking softly against the linoleum floor. She wore a dark green coat that hung a little loose at the shoulders, and her hair was pinned in the careful way of someone who still believed in dignity before speaking. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was unshakable. "Jasmine," she said, "you didn't take down a man." The room went still. Jasmine turned to face her fully. "You brought the whole system back to the ground," the woman continued, "just so it'd remember. It once served people, not power." The silence that followed wasn't stunned. It was reverent. Jasmine didn't respond right away. She didn't need to. The words had landed where they needed to, deep in the gut of every person present. One by one, heads nodded, first subtly, then without hesitation. No applause, just acknowledgement. And Jasmine, who had faced down one of the most powerful institutions in America, stood there like she always had, not above the people, but among them. That single sentence, the one spoken by a woman whose name was never printed in papers, spread faster than any campaign slogan. Within days, it was quoted on podcast intros, etched into protest signs, and painted in murals outside community centers. "You didn't take down a man. You brought the system back to the ground." The words weren't about vengeance. They were about restoration, reminding a nation that systems should kneel to the people, not the other way around. And yet it was the second sentence, the one that came next, quiet and untelevised, that would echo in a very different place. Law schools across the country, Stanford, Howard, Yale, Texas Southern, began quoting it not as poetry, but as precedent. It appeared first in a classroom in Baltimore, handwritten in chalk across a blackboard left up for days. When one person dares to tell the truth in open court, power starts to tremble. By week's end, the quote had been translated into Spanish, Vietnamese, Arabic, and Swahili, hung above lecture halls and printed at the top of ethics syllabi. Professors called it the Crockett Principle. Students called it a call to arms. And judges, those who still believed in the robes they wore, read it with equal parts pride and warning. For the first time in decades, the legal profession was no longer speaking about judicial power as an immovable object, but as a mirror that needed cleaning. Back in Texas, Jasmine didn't tweet about it. She didn't post pictures of the quote being shared. But when asked by a law student during a Q&A what she thought of the phrase, she smiled. Not wide, not proud, just quietly, and said, "I didn't write it, but I lived it, and I hope none of you ever have to, unless you must." Because that was the heart of it. Jasmine hadn't gone looking for a fight with a Supreme Court justice. She hadn't written a speech for a headline or scripted a takedown for applause. She had simply refused to lie, when lying would have been safer, easier, and far more profitable. She had stepped into a courtroom not to perform, but to defend herself with the only weapon she had ever trusted: truth. And the world had trembled not because of how loud she spoke, but because she never backed away from the silence that came before it. But beyond the headlines, beyond the hashtags, beyond the historic reform bills and the silence of a disgraced justice, there lies something deeper, something more lasting, the human lesson born from a woman's refusal to surrender in the face of impossible odds. What Jasmine Crockett did was not just brave, it was costly. She stood before an institution designed to erase dissent, and she refused to flinch, not because she believed she would win, but because she believed losing with her voice intact was better than surviving in silence. That is where the heart of this story lies, not in the gavel that fell, not in the judge who crumbled, but in the moment Jasmine chose to speak, knowing the machine might crush her for it. It would have been easier to stay quiet, to play the political game, to absorb the injustice with a tight jaw and wait for it to pass. But Jasmine Crockett didn't come from the halls of privilege. She came from the spaces where justice is not promised, but fought for daily, where silence has always been the enemy of survival. She knew that if she didn't speak that day, the next Black woman sitting at that table wouldn't get the chance. And that knowledge, that quiet, personal burden, is what transformed her defiance into something far greater than a political moment. Because courage is not just standing up. It's standing still while the weight of a system tries to break your spine. It's holding eye contact with those who are betting on your collapse. It's knowing that truth doesn't guarantee safety and still choosing to tell it anyway. Jasmine stood in that courtroom not with armor, but with history behind her. She carried the voices of women like her who had been locked out of power, of courtrooms, of truth itself. She carried every false accusation, every closed door, every condescending stare that told her she didn't belong. And she turned that history into a weapon, not to destroy, but to reveal. Because some systems don't need to be torn down with rage. They just need to be seen clearly. And that clarity alone is enough to make them fall. And what happened in the days after wasn't just a shift in politics. It was a shift in moral gravity. For decades, Americans had been told, implicitly and explicitly, that judges were untouchable, that the law policed itself, that oversight was mistrust, that questioning power was somehow a threat to the balance. But Jasmine didn't just question power. She placed it under oath. She asked the question that every American has wanted to ask but was too afraid to say aloud. Who judges the judges? And when no answer came, when the most powerful man in the room chose silence over accountability, the public finally understood. This wasn't about one case. This was about an entire system that had forgotten who it worked for. The lesson, then, is terrifying in its simplicity. Unchecked power will always bend toward self-preservation unless someone is willing to stand in its path. Jasmine did, alone. And the entire country saw that when she stood, the illusion shattered. Because when a system depends on fear to function, the moment someone refuses to be afraid, it loses its grip. She did not storm the bench. She did not call for chaos. She simply spoke, and power recoiled. That is the most dangerous thing you can do in a broken structure. Remind it that it's accountable to the people it was built to serve. There is something profoundly human about that choice. Jasmine didn't come in with certainty. She didn't know the cameras would catch her words. She didn't know the judge would falter. She didn't know the law would shift in her wake. All she knew was that something had to be said, and that it would cost her more to stay silent than it would to risk speaking. That kind of clarity doesn't come from ambition. It comes from memory, from having lived the cost of silence before, from having felt the weight of a false accusation and vowed never to let another person carry it alone. Jasmine brought that memory into the courtroom like a second skin, and when the system tried to paint her as the problem, she responded with facts, with documents, with undeniable receipts, and in doing so, made clear who the problem really was. What followed, laws, headlines, resignations, was secondary. The real shift happened in the invisible places, in the breath people held when she spoke, in the classrooms where her words now line the walls, in the quiet understanding between citizens that the law is not a fortress, but a mirror, and it will only reflect what we are willing to look at. So what, then, is the lesson? That justice is not inevitable, it is not automatic, it is not permanent. Justice must be chosen, justice must be fought for, justice must be protected, not just by those in power, but by those willing to risk everything when power goes too far. Jasmine Crockett reminded us that the law belongs to the people, not to titles, not to robes, not to those whose names are carved into stone above courthouses, but to the ones who walk through those doors with nothing but truth and still refuse to bow. That is the true legacy of her story. Not that she survived the system, but that she changed its shape with nothing more than courage and clarity. And perhaps the most powerful part of that truth is that any of us can do the same. But Jasmine's story was never meant to be the final word. It was meant to be the first shot in a war for accountability, a call echoing in every hallway of power, in every quiet place where injustice survives, because no one dares to challenge it. Now, the question isn't what happened to her. The question is, what will we do with what we've seen? Because after everything she endured, after the silence she broke, and the system she exposed, Jasmine Crockett didn't ask for applause. She asked for action. She didn't ask to be lifted up on shoulders. She asked that we stop looking the other way. And now if you're reading this, if you followed her story, if your heart raced when the courtroom froze and the truth finally spoke louder than the robe, then this moment belongs to you too. You are not a bystander anymore. You're a witness. And with that comes a responsibility no one gets to outsource. Because power only survives unchecked when good people choose comfort over confrontation, when we accept the lie that the law belongs to the powerful instead of remembering it was built to protect the vulnerable. It starts with knowing. Read the bill, the Judicial Transparency Act of 2025. Don't wait for filtered headlines. Don't let politicians define its meaning for you. The words inside it were forged in the fire of a woman's public humiliation and private courage. Learn them, quote them, share them. Send them to your representative and demand to know, do you support this, or are you waiting for the next scandal to pretend you care? Don't let them hide behind procedure. Demand a vote, demand public positions, demand clarity. Because if you stay quiet now, you're telling the next Jasmine that when the system comes for her, she'll be on her own. And this goes deeper than legislation. It means calling out hypocrisy when you see it, in courtrooms, classrooms, newsrooms. It means checking the financial disclosures of those who rule on your life, but think they answer to no one. It means supporting whistleblowers, not doubting them. It means remembering that truth doesn't survive because it's popular. It survives because someone defends it when it's not. Jasmine did, but she should never have had to do it alone. You can organize. You can protest. You can run for office. You can pressure those already in power to pass the reforms she proposed. Demand quarterly disclosures from judges. Demand protections for court staff who speak up. Demand an independent oversight council, not tied to any party, not answerable to any president. This isn't radical. This is baseline integrity. And if you think it's too idealistic, ask yourself who benefits from your cynicism, because it's never the people being stepped on. Talk to your friends. Start with one person. Share the clip. Tell them what she did, what it cost her, and what it exposed. Remind them that while the cameras are off now, the rot she uncovered is still embedded in the system, still hiding behind titles and tradition and silence. Jasmine cracked it open. It's on us to tear it out, not through outrage for a week, but through sustained, unrelenting pressure. Because that's the only thing power respects. And if you ever wonder whether it's worth the fight, if calling your congressperson matters, if joining a local oversight committee makes a dent, if challenging a judge's record means anything, remember this: a single congresswoman, cornered by accusations designed to destroy her, walked into a courtroom and made the most powerful man in that room walk out in silence. Not with fury, not with vengeance, with truth. That is what accountability looks like when someone stops asking for permission to speak and simply does. So don't wait for permission either, Because the real danger isn't that Jasmine Crockett was targeted. The real danger is if we let them get away with it. This is your moment now. Don't miss it. Don't waste it. And above all, don't stay silent. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.